This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog video about Limited. We're pretty deep in the format now, that format being Phyrexia, all will be one. So today I wanted to give you an overview of the 10 color pairs and also my tier list for where these color pairs rank. So let's dive right in. First up, I've got red-green. I don't think this one is a big surprise. This is pretty much the consensus #1 deck in the format. It is a really good deck. You know, the Signpost Uncommon cares about oil, it becomes cheaper, and there are a lot of red and green cards that have oil counters, so it's really not that hard to just like play a deck of red and green cards and cast this thing early. It kills a lot of small stuff in the format, and there's a lot of it. There's also a key common. I have one of these for every one of these color pairs that I think, is a card that really fits into this deck better than any other. And for that, I have Koldatha Cackler, this 3-mana 2/3 trample that gets +1/+0 when it attacks for each creature, or permanent even, you have with an oil counter on it. This fits in the other oil decks, none of which I think are as good as we'll see. But it really fits here because this deck's main thing is just that its creatures are way more efficient than the others. You have the 4-mana 4/3 Mantis that you can remove an oil counter from when it attacks, and it becomes a 5/4. The fact it untaps itself is great because it can play defense. And then you have the 5-mana 4/5 with 2 oil counters. You can remove oil counters to give things haste. These are just commons, and they are really good cards in the format. They're bigger than most of the creatures in the format. And, just curving out with these is a big deal. And that's one thing to say about this deck. You can have a version of this deck that has barely any actual oil synergy, and it's still really good, just because the red and green commons are quite good, and you have access to basically the most efficient, powerful creatures in the format. Now, the deck usually is better if you can get there on oil synergy and you can attack with a big trampling hyena and make your Signpost Uncommon cost less and take advantage of churning reservoir and other stuff. Like, that is a better version of the deck, but I will say, some of these decks, synergy is incredibly important, and for others, it's kind of more of a sub-theme. And I think that's kind of true of the red-green deck, and that's part of what makes it good, I think, is it's not as reliant on reaching a critical mass of X kind of card as some of the other archetypes are. So it comes together the most and the most easily. Just a pile of red and green commons is a pretty good deck in the format. Next up, I have Black-White Corrupted. Your Signpost Uncommon here is the 5-mana 4/4 with Vigilance that if you have Corrupted, which means your opponent has 3 poison counters or more, if you have it, it just destroys a permanent, which is absurdly powerful, obviously. If you can consistently get Corrupted, you're going to be in great shape, and that's the whole plan with this deck. So this is sort of, I was just talking about how the red-green deck, synergy's there, but it's not all important. That's opposite is true here. This deck is a synergy deck. You need to have a critical mass of creatures with toxic, or this deck is not good. And there's luckily a lot of them, but if you only end up with like 7 toxic creatures in this deck, your deck's just going to be bad, because you have to consistently be able to get your opponent to 3 or more poison so that you can fully unlock your cards, like your Signpost Uncommon, like the key common I have, which is Incisor Glider. I like this a lot in this particular slot. Obviously, it can fit in like green-white, which is also a toxic deck, which we'll talk about in a second. But it fits really well here because Black-White has the access to a bunch of ways to go wide with mites. And, so Incisor Glider is good anyway, but because you're going to be going wide most of the time without even trying that hard, the Glider gets to be even more potent. And this is not really, and it's true, I'll talk about some of the toxic decks where you actually win with poison. This isn't one really. You'd really just want to get your opponent to 3 poison and turn on all your corrupted cards so that they're way better. Sometimes you'll kill them with poison, but you usually are doing similar amounts of damage or more damage, in which case, your opponent's going to die to damage. But again, this is a synergy deck. It's a lot easier for a black-white draft to completely train wreck, and that's a downside. But the ceiling is really high. There's just so many powerful corrupted cards, and there's powerful, well, they're not all powerful, but there are enablers like the 2-mana 1/1 with Toxic 1 and stuff that really make it consistent for you if you drafted this deck well to get to 3 poison and to do your thing with all your corrupted cards. I think the third deck that's in this top tier is red-white equipment. So this is another deck where synergy is sort of a sub-theme. It's not the main thing you're doing with the deck. You know, your Signpost Uncommon is incredibly powerful. They all are, really, especially in this top tier. But, you know, this one is effectively a 3-mana 2/2 with double strike that, you know, can move around its double strike for hefty mana cost. That also reduces the cost of your other equipment. All the equipment in the set, of course, has 4 Mirrodin, or almost all of it. And because of that, they're all reasonably efficient and solid cards. I have here as the sort of Signpost common, I have Bladegraft Aspirant. If you do really get there on the equipment synergy with this deck, it is really good. I mean, reducing the cost of your equipment, which also all happen to put a creature into play, is a big deal. And reducing equip cost to itself is a big deal. It has Menace. And it doesn't fit super well into any other deck in the format, so that's sort of how it ends up here. If you're not doing equipment stuff, it's a pretty mediocre card. If you are, it can get pretty silly. But like I said, this is sort of like the red-green deck in that you can just sort of build a red-white aggro deck with a lot of really good 1 and 2 drops and some red removal spells, some ways to do direct damage to your opponent, and have, like, you know, 3 equipment in the deck, and it's still pretty good. It is usually better if you're getting there on equipment synergy because there's some powerful stuff, especially at uncommon between your Signpost and the Hex Gold Hover Wings and stuff. Like, that's pretty spicy. But this is another one that's not really a synergy deck, black-white, where you can train wreck pretty easily if you don't have enough ways to get poison on your opponent. This deck can be perfectly solid with very little equipment synergy, just on the strength of good red and white commons. And the last deck I have in this top tier, it's another poison deck, and it's green-white Toxic. So this is another one that doesn't really win by poisoning your opponent. It does sometimes. But interestingly, green-white is more about getting extra value out of creatures that have Toxic, if that makes sense. Like, there are a bunch of bonuses your cards can offer, like look at the Signpost Uncommon. It buffs your toxic creatures +1/+1 when they attack. That's a huge deal on a 2-mana 2/2 that also has Toxic too. You can play it, and the turn you do, it can attack your opponent. Well, it can't, but the things you already had in play can, and so it affects the board immediately. And that's kind of what green-white's about. It's about getting extra value out of creatures that say Toxic on them, and less about actually caring about poison. I have the key common here, for example, is Flensing Raptor. You know, this is a card that gives flying and +1/+1 to a Toxic creature when it enters the battlefield, has Toxic itself. You know, there's a bunch of other cards that buff Toxic creatures or give you bonuses. There's the combat trick that draws you a card if you use it on a creature with Toxic. Like, a lot of these cards just make your Toxic creatures bigger and better, but they don't actually make them better at poisoning your opponent. You don't have that much access to proliferate, so that's not what you're doing. You just want to have kind of an aggressive curve and a bunch of your cards say Toxic on them. This one is a little less synergy-driven, I would say, than black-white, because you can end up with just a good assortment of green-white cards and sort of a medium amount of synergy with Toxic, and it still can be a decent deck, but I would say it's more reliant on you reaching that critical mass of Toxic cards and Toxic payoffs, and needs more synergy than red-green or red-white do to be good, but not quite as much as black-white. But it also doesn't really have a ceiling as high as any of those. It's still in the first tier, but I do have it at the bottom of the first tier for a reason. So that's our first tier. These are the best decks in the format, the ones that can very consistently come together. You know, even though I've said, you know, you got to keep an eye on synergy, especially for black-white, you usually can do it. You just have to be intentional and thinking about what you're drafting, and it'll happen. I mean, assuming these color pairs are open. That is, you know, a caveat that I guess I should mention. You shouldn't, like, force these decks just because they think they're the 4 best that the most consistently and powerfully can come together, because if everyone else at the table is drafting these, you need to do something else. But my point is that these are the best when you really get them going. And getting them going isn't that hard in your typical draft. So let's move into the second tier. These are still decks that are good, that I feel perfectly happy to end up in, but they aren't quite as powerful or consistent as the first tier. So at the top of the second tier, I have blue-white artifacts. So this, you'll notice in the first tier, didn't mention a single blue deck. So blue kind of has a problem in this format. It's certainly the weakest color. There aren't that many cards that really, especially at common, that pull you into blue. But this is the best blue deck. And, you know, I think it's pretty close to being in the first tier. It sort of fluctuates a little bit for me. And obviously it's about artifacts. Your Signpost Uncommon is a 4-mana, 0/5 artifact creature that gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. Counts itself. And this is another synergy deck, obviously. You need to grab a critical mass of cards that say artifact in the text box or artifact on the type line to really excel with this deck. If you don't, you know, if you end up with a blue-white deck that doesn't have enough artifacts, this deck's bad. Good news is a lot of blue-white cards that are fine just happen to be artifacts, so it does come together. I think the key common here is Mandible Justicure. This thing, 2-mana, 2/1 with lifelink. It's +1/+1 every time an artifact enters the battlefield. There are plenty of ways to put more than one artifact into play at a time, especially with like might tokens, which are really nice here because they also make like your Signpost Uncommon a lot stronger. And yeah, I mean, this thing can attack for a lot. If your opponent doesn't find a way to trade with it quickly, it can just put the game out of reach, especially if you have multiples. You know, sometimes I've had 4 or 5, which is completely insane. The big downside about them, and it's maybe the thing that makes this deck second tier, is like its best common, the common that you really want for this deck, lines up really poorly against a bunch of the 1-drops in the format, especially key ones in that first tier. So, you know, Crawling Chorus, for example, really makes Mandible Justicure very sad. And that's a problem because it's just a common 1-drop. But, you know, if you can find ways to consistently buff it, it does cause serious problems. There are times where you can attack with these so hard that your opponent can't block anyway. And of course, you can use tricks. You can make mites at instant speed. There's sweet stuff you can do. There's some super powerful uncommons that I think really elevate this deck. I think the best versions, for example, have Unctus's Retrofitter, which can just turn an artifact into a 4/4. You can animate one that's not already a creature or make something like your Justicure into a 4/4. Still holds on to lifelink. It's very powerful, and it's the kind of card, you know, there aren't a lot of blue cards that pull you into a deck. That one does. It's a powerful enough uncommon. I think I'd take it over a lot of rares in the format and see if the artifact deck is open because it's that good. So that's blue-white. It's a synergy deck. We're going to continue to see sort of an interesting mix in this format between decks that I think are really high in synergy and decks that are not. But this is one of them. You got to have cards that say artifact in the text box or on the type line, like I said, or you don't really have a deck. Next, and this one I think it's maybe my most controversial opinion, and that is that I have blue-black as, I guess, the 6th best deck in the format. There's a big caveat here that maybe it should mean that I put it lower, and that is that this deck is incredibly reliant on having uncommons. Like if it doesn't have them, it can't function really. And the main uncommons are, of course, the Signpost, which this deck, by the way, is about proliferating. And this is a deck that can kill the opponent with poison because of proliferate. It does it more often than any deck we've seen so far. You just poison your opponent early and you proliferate some and you can kill your opponent. But if that's your only plan, it doesn't work out that well. You also need to have this proliferate value plan, which usually involves your Signpost uncommon. It's a 2/1 with Toxic 1, and every time you proliferate, it can come back from your graveyard to your hand. And then you also have the uncommon 2-mana 1/3 that drains the opponent 2 every time you proliferate. You basically need a couple copies of both of these and to make this deck work. And when you do, it's great. I mean, that's why I have it so high. I think it has a very high ceiling. It can actually grind out games against all of the aggressive decks in the format, and this is obviously somewhat less aggressive one. But it does need these uncommons. And I can tell you that 40 plus drafts into the format, this deck has been open enough for me to jump in on it twice. And both times I got to 7 wins. It was an insane deck. And I've run into insane proliferate decks that just grind out all this value with these 2 uncommons. And, often can just poison you out or win with damage or whatever. So this deck has a very high ceiling. Like, if this deck were consistently what it is, when you get like 2 of each of these uncommons, it would be in the first tier. So I've downgraded it a lot to put it where I did, but I do think this deck has a very high ceiling. It doesn't come together as often, so maybe you can argue I should drop it to the bottom of this tier, but I think the ceiling on it is so high that it should be here. I have the key common as Blight Belly Rat. This thing is pretty nice. It's a real frustrating card to play against when you're actually worried about poison, because if you play it early, if your opponent plays it early and can get a couple of poison counters on you, a third one's coming at some point, because when it dies, it proliferates, and it's great because it can die and trigger your powerful proliferate stuff in this particular deck. But like I said, you really can't have a good version of this deck without those uncommons. You need the proliferate value train, or this deck is a very subpar sort of mid-ranger control deck, which isn't a great place to be in the format. So obviously this is another synergy deck. You need these uncommons, and you need cards that say proliferate on them, or things don't go well. Next up, I have blue-red, which is a spell deck, as it often is, but it's also an oil deck, and this is a deck that I think can function with less synergy. Your Signpost Uncommon obviously likes it when you cast spells. It gets an oil counter. You can cash those in to draw cards and maybe bolt something. That's powerful. But it is a little slow in this format. Things that proliferate and are spells are really nice in the deck. I have, though, the thing that's kind of awkward about this deck for me is I think the best common in it is actually just like a random card that does have oil counters but doesn't care about spells, and that's Gataxian Raptor. Like, this thing, probably just blue's best common. That's not saying a lot because blue's commons aren't great, but it turns out a 3-mana 1/4 flyer that can change its stats at will between a bunch of different options is pretty good. I mean, it makes your opponent stop attacking you on a lot of boards, and it can threaten a ton of damage on a lot of boards. So I like it a lot in this deck. You can get more oil counters on it more easily. You have some payoff for doing oil things, but that's kind of the awkward thing here is you have these... some of your best cards for this deck don't really do anything with spells, so it is more of an oil deck than anything else in most ways. It's a perfectly solid deck when it comes together, but I'm never like blown away by a blue-red oil deck either. But because it doesn't require massive amounts of synergy, and I think you can end up with a pretty good just, blue-red deck that has ways to interact and removal and some flyers, I do think the fact that it is sort of a consistent deck that can come together with relative ease does make it, a decent deck, a solid deck in this second tier. And then at the bottom of the second tier, I have black-red. This is also an oil deck. It's supposed to have a sub-theme of your stuff dies and you get value out of it. As you can see from the Signpost Uncommon, the 3-mana 3/2 that makes a 1/1. And when something dies, it gets an oil counter. And when it gets to 3 oil counters, you can remove them to basically draw a card. This Signpost Uncommon is really strong. It definitely has a claim to maybe the best signpost in the set, but the unfortunate thing is that it's part of this deck, which is, I have it here as the 8th best out of 10, so, that tells you something. Basically the problem with this deck is it's like a worse version of red-green, because the death get oil counters angle just doesn't come together that well. You have some ways to sacrifice things. I have as the key common here, Cutthroat Centurion, because if you can, sacrifice some artifacts and stuff to put oil counters on your things, which, by the way, all of the things that care about something dying also, I'll say, if an artifact, goes to the graveyard. So that's where you can get some nice value going, and that can result in some pretty absurd turns. The Centurion is an attacker your opponent really has to be worried about, especially because if you have other things in play that care about these oil counters, things can get interesting. But, black-red, when it's great, usually it has access to a lot more sacrifice synergy than this. And like I said, you have access to like all the good red oil creatures that are nice sized, like the 4/5 haste, but you don't have the green ones. And, that's definitely a problem overall. And that makes the deck, I think, less powerful. It's like a worse oil deck than all the other oil decks are. And it's not as good at like making an aggressive curve. It doesn't have enough of an identity, and unlike the other decks that don't have that much synergy, like red green and red white, it needs it because black overall doesn't offer as powerful of commons as those color pairs do. So that's a second tier. We still got a third tier. Got a couple of decks there, of course. Both of these are overall not very impressive decks, even when they do come together. And they are incredibly reliant on having your signpost uncommon in most ways. At least that's true of the first one we'll talk about, which is black-green. So this is a deck, when it does come together, it's the most consistent deck in the format at poisoning your opponent out. So that, that's a thing. This deck can really do it. And it's partly because of the signpost, which is really strong. It makes all of your toxic things more poisonous, and it can give toxic things death touch. So it really has this nice effect that makes everything with toxic a big problem. This deck is interested in playing these green creatures that have really high toxic values. I have, as the signpost here, Tyrannak's Atrocity. And it's cards like this that can let you really poison your opponent out, because one hit puts 3 poison on them, and this thing has haste. Like, this is nice, a nice, mid-range top end to have in this deck. If you imagine just having, it's not rare to play the signpost on turn 4 and then the atrocity on turn 5. That is a powerful sequence, and you'll see it happen. And then this deck has access to enough proliferate that it can poison you out with that too. But the problem is, if you don't get the signpost, you basically have a collection of pretty mediocre cards that have toxic on them, and you don't have access to a lot of the best poison payoffs that are, a lot of them are in white, and you don't have those. It's a big difference between green white and green black in terms of power level, because you just don't have in black that many poison payoffs that are great, or even creatures with toxic that are that good. I mean, Stinging Hive Master is fine, and they're around, but it just doesn't have access to enough of it. But this is a deck that is real enough in the format. You do end up drafting this sometimes, and it can win with poison. And, I think it is significantly better than our next deck, which I think is the worst in the format by a significant distance. I could have even had a fourth tier, maybe, because I think this deck is so mediocre. And that is blue-green. That's the only color pair left. This one was supposed to be like a proliferate deck, so sort of what blue-black is, but the problem is, for the blue-black deck, I said you need the signpost uncommon and you need a black uncommon. This deck doesn't have access to those. This deck was sort of supposed to be able to poison the opponent and proliferate and poison them out, and that can happen. This deck's not unplayable. If blue-green is really open, you end up with a good deck. You have a signpost uncommon that's a really efficient creature that can allow you to proliferate over and over again. It's a good signpost uncommon. But after that, blue is really lacking in terms of toxic, which is awkward because it feels like overall blue-green is a deck that wants to be poisoning, but blue has very little in the way of toxic. I think maybe the only thing with toxic is awkwardly Unctus's Retrofitter. I guess there's a trick that gives toxic too, but the Retrofitter's not even good in this deck because you don't really need artifacts. So it's a very awkward situation. And it's just a deck that doesn't really come together. This is a fairly assertive format, and this deck doesn't have enough ways to make the game go long and play out its game plan, largely because it doesn't have what blue-black has in terms of proliferate payoffs that, drain life or allow you to keep blocking with a creature and bring it back while you're also poisoning your opponent. So blue-green is pretty bad. It's the only one on this list that I would say you should start most drafts by avoiding. So the others, there are cards that you can open pack one, pick one that make you really consider being in the other 9 decks. Maybe they have to be rares. Like with black green, it pretty much has to be Glissa, but I feel good about that. I think black green is a real deck. Blue green is significantly less of one. The other 9, all very viable. The 10th, not really. So, and that's not great, but honestly, there are limited formats that have way fewer decks than this that are viable. And sure, I only think 8 are like very viable. And then these last 2, not so much, but that's still pretty good. I think the format overall, it has problems. I'll talk about it more in sort of the format retrospective at the end of it. But, blue is too weak. That's not good. That's kind of sums up the format's main problem. But overall, I think it's a solid format. I think the way I've described it so far basically is it's interesting enough to keep me coming back to play it more right now, but it's not a format I'm going to be excited about coming back to if they have it on a flashback or whatever. All right, so let's go ahead and close things out with a crack-a-pack. This video is always kind of long, so I thought about maybe not doing one, but I think enough people seem to like it that I'll go ahead and do one here at the end. This is where I show you a pack one, pick one scenario, and I talk about all the cards in the pack, how I feel about them, and then tell you, what I would first pick. All right, so here's our pack. Our first common is Vivisurgeon's Insight. I mean, this is the kind of card that is kind of the problem with like blue-green being good. This is the kind of card that was pretty much there, I think, for blue-green, but, paying 5 to draw 3 and proliferate, you'll play one of these in a deck like blue-green or even blue-black and maybe even blue-red, but it's usually like your 23rd card. There's just a lot of board states where you can't. Lots of games have a turn 5 where casting this means you're dead, and that makes it pretty bad. Like, this format, it has sort of leveled out some, but it's still a fast, assertive format where taking turns off from adding to the board can be a death sentence, and this thing just isn't very good. If you play them, you pick them up really late in packs, and you're usually only playing one. Ichorspit Basilisk is next. This is fine. I like that it works with all the fight cards to kill anything because it has Death Touch. It has Toxic, so that gives it value in decks like green-white. But it's not one of these toxic creatures you're really excited about to have in your deck either. Prophetic Prism is next. This is nice in blue-white and to a lesser extent in black-red. This is one of these random artifacts that you can sacrifice for value to like the 3 mana 2/2 that sacrifices stuff. And because it drew you a card, it doesn't really hurt. Also fixes your mana, of course, but you don't want to take it early. Quicksilver Fisher. This is another card that explains why blue is as mediocre as it is. This card is, just too inefficient for what it does. There are too many creatures. Like if you play this on turn 5, there's a good chance that almost your opponent's entire board can just attack into it without fear. And that's a problem. So it's not good at all. Thirsting Roots. This card's, if you're going to be fixing, this isn't a bad way to do it, especially if you're in a deck like green-black. I don't like it as much in green-red, but, green-black is a deck that, thanks to Thirsting Roots, it can fix reasonably well. Proliferate works pretty well in the deck, too. It's not something you take early, though. We actually have a second Vivisurgeon's Insight, because that first one was a foil, so moving on from that. Next up, we got Planar Disruption. Definitely our new, we haven't really had anything we want to first pick. I guess up until now, it's the Basilisk or Prophetic Prism. Planar Disruption is our first card that you want to first pick. So one of the things about this format is, like I was saying, there are a lot of decks that are very reliant on synergy. So there are cards that you see in these packs that are really good in X deck, but if you take it early, there's a chance you don't play it because it's so medium in the other decks. Cards like Planar Disruption are nice because they're just good in every deck. Every white deck will play Planar Disruption and be very happy. And so it's a nice first pick for that reason, and it's just a great card in general. It's a very good pacifism variant. There are some cards that hurt it, like the 4 mana 3/4 Toxic one that lets your opponent return a card to their hand and make a 1/1. But overall, it's a really well-performing card in the format, and certainly what we first pick. Next up, we have Koldatha Cackler. I had this as the key common for red-green, and I think that's true, but it's not so good that you take it over a card that's good in every deck. Like, even its ceiling is probably a little lower than Planar Disruption, where you're attacking with it as a 5 or 6 power trampler. I'd still take the Disruption over it. Next up, I've got the Hunter Maze. I like running like one of these in the more aggressive decks in the format. The mid-rangier decks, like your blue blacks and your blue greens, I guess, and such. Running a couple is a little better. The reason they're not great in a lot of like the red white, green white, even red green decks is because you usually want to play a 1-drop on turn 1 and a 2-drop on turn 2. You just want to curve out it, and these can hamper that. And plus, you want to win the game quickly. But if you're in a deck that's going a little longer, running like 2 is fine because you're likely to actually need them, for helping you out in the mid to late game. But you don't take them early. We're still on Planar Disruption. We got Blight Belly Rat next. I had this as the key common for blue black, but it fits in all the black decks. It's nice in it doesn't have as high of a ceiling as Disruption, but it does work in every black deck in the format because they're all interested in Toxic or Proliferate, and it does both. So it works out pretty well. I don't know that I would feel good about ever first picking it, but it is a card. I'm just trying to say that slots into any deck, unlike Kuldothic Cackler does. So, so we're still on Planar Disruption here. Moving into the uncommons, we have Plated Onslaught. Running one of these can be fine in decks like black-white or green-white. Red-white to a lesser extent. I only find myself doing it if I'm really going wide, and especially with pest tokens, because then it's very cheap. As always, it's like a card that either does nothing or wins you the game, and that's always kind of swingy, but it is playable in the right deck, not something you take early. We've got Bladed Ambassador next. This is pretty nice. It has maybe been a little bit underwhelming, mostly for a similar problem I've mentioned earlier in the video. It only has 1 toughness, and it's a 2-drop, so like the Mandible Justiciar. So it's like horrible against Crawling Chorus. And sure, that's 1 card in the format, but there's a few others that it's pretty bad against too, where a cheaper 1-mana creature is just better. And sure, you can make it indestructible, but if you play this on turn 2 and your opponent played a Crawling Chorus on turn 1, it feels pretty awful, and I'm sure you've experienced that. That said, it is a very good card. It's got a nice aggressive stat line. It can, survive lethal damage or a destruction effect once if you have the mana up. I would still take Disruption over it, but it's probably the second best card. It's another card that it does slot right into every white deck. It doesn't do anything synergistic, but just having a good 2-drop is something you want in basically every deck. Our next uncommon is Trawler Drake. This is pretty good. I mean, especially in blue-red. I was talking about that deck likes cards that both proliferate and are spells. So if you cast one of those things, like Vivisurgeon's Insight, a little too expensive, but, maybe like Volt Surge is a better example. This becomes a 3/3, and it just keeps growing from there. The downside is it is a 3-mana 1/1 for a turn usually, and that's not so good. Very vulnerable to lots and lots of removal. But it's a nice card. I would still take Disruption and Bladed Ambassador over it, but it's maybe number 3. You can maybe talk me into the Cackler being better, but yeah. It's pretty funny. Our rare is Glissa Sunslayer, the card I said, if I open up a Glissa Sunslayer, I'm going to see if Black-Green's open, because I think the deck's good enough, and Glissa's really good. And we got Glissa. She's a huge bomb. She's basically impossible to block. And when she hits your opponent, she has a big effect. So your opponent is put in a very pick your poison scenario. She even defends well with First Strike and Death Touch. So she's great, and she's what we take here. She's 2 colors, and that factors in because you're like, okay, this card has a lower percentage of making my deck, because if I don't end up in black-green or end up in green or black with good fixing, I'm not going to play it. But the upside of playing it is way higher than playing anything else in this pack. And the probability of you playing it is reasonable. Like, she is splashable, and if black-green's open, you're going to be very happy with this as a first pick, and the chances of it being open are decent enough. So definitely Glissa, followed by Planar Disruption, and then Bladed Ambassador, and then Trawler Drake and Kuldothic Cackler after that. So that is our Crack It Back for the week. I'll be back next week, and I think next week I'll be hitting you guys with 10 bad cards in the format that people are playing too much. So that's what we'll look at next time. Until then, thanks for watching. Like and share the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.